Welcome back, guys. How you guys doing? You good? Did you enjoy the first speaker? Did you get any information that was pertinent to your reason for being here today? All right. Next, we're on time. I like being on time. Coming up next, I have Ms. Julie Swanson, co-founder of YourSpecialEducationRights.com. Let's give her a warm welcome. Ms. Julie Swanson.
Okay.
One more thing, excuse me. Please write down your questions that you may have during while Julie is speaking so that afterwards we can have a question and answer. We'll go around and pick up the sheets and ask the questions, okay? Please remember to do that. Once again, Ms. Julie Swanson.
Hello, everybody. I am so happy to be here, and I want to thank Helen for asking me to come to speak. Helen asked me to speak about the book that I co-authored with my partner, special education attorney Jennifer Laviano, and I am Julie Swanson. I'm a special education advocate. Can I just see how many people in the audience are professionals? Okay, and how many people are parents? Okay, great. I always just like to have a sense of who I'm talking to, so that's terrific. Okay, so I'm going to stand here and talk to you about some of the best tips that I have as a parent and somebody who's been doing advocacy for 20 years. And I'm also going to talk to you about some of the tips that are in the book. But I thought before I do that, I should probably tell you just a little bit about myself and how I got here. My son was diagnosed with autism in 1997 when he was 3 years old. That was back in the dinosaur days of autism. I thought I was the only person on the planet who had a child with autism. We all know what happened, and the numbers just keep going on up. I was the second case in the state of Connecticut to take a district to due process to fight for an applied behavior analytic program for my child. And I prevailed on that case. And after that, people started calling me because, you know, it's a small community, the autism community. And back then it was even smaller. Let's remember, there was no internet, there was nothing. Everything was word of mouth. But people started to call me because they said, oh gosh, can you give me a tip on, you know, how to get my school district to do this, that, or the other? Before you know it, it blossoms into I realized, well, should I go back to work at what I used to do? Or is this something that I could do for a living because people really need this? And of course, I chose to become a professional special education advocate. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that I'm really passionate about that aren't necessarily in the book. And you know, when I go to a conference, I always say to myself, if I just walk away with one nugget of something that I didn't know before I came, that makes it all worthwhile for me. I hope you walk away with more than one. There's a lot of great speakers here today, so I have a feeling you're going to walk away with a lot. But I hope that you walk away with something you didn't know before you came in today. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can tell you that there is a direct correlation between your advocacy efforts and your child's outcome. Let that sink in for a minute. There's a direct correlation between your advocacy efforts and your child's outcome. Okay, and as my mother used to say, there is no one waiting in line behind you to advocate for your child. Nobody. You're it, okay? And if there's anything in life worth fighting for, it's your child. Those are some of my guiding principles. I'm going to talk about some of the things that are in the book, but I'm first going to read an excerpt about the book because the title of the book is Your Special Education Rights, What Your School District Isn't Telling You. And so, I'm going to read this excerpt. We realize that emphasizing what school districts might not tell parents may have the unintended consequence of leaving educators and administrators with the impression that we have written this book to bash school districts. We have not. In fact, we are both products of public education. We believe in it strongly. We recognize that the vast majority of people who choose to become teachers do so because they love children and they care about education. We believe that most administrators are trying their best under enormous financial and legal pressure. And let me tell you, that's a real thing, okay? Our sincere hope is that our candid account does not alienate educators and administrators, but rather raises awareness of how difficult it can be to navigate this special education process. And it's difficult. Let's not kid ourselves about that. Please keep in mind that our experience on a daily basis for decades represents situations where it's gotten bad enough that legal or expert advocacy help may be required. But our goal and why we wrote this book is the empowerment of parents so they can work shoulder to shoulder with their school districts on behalf of their child rather than against them. Okay? All right. So I want to start by talking about the fact that you can't change somebody else's behavior until you change your own. That's another one of my guiding principles. Let me give you a few examples. When I first started advocating for my child many, many years ago, he's now 24 years old and in the adult world, the school district would just set the times for the IEP. And they would never ask me. And that really bothered me. And you know, under the IDEA, that PPT meetings, which we call them here in Connecticut, but they're really IEPT meetings, are supposed to be scheduled with the parents' availability in mind. And many school districts, I'm sure for very logistical management reasons, just spit out a date to parents many times. And so it took about 5 times, but I'd call and I'd say, unfortunately, I can't make this. Can you I'd like to do it when I'm available. And we'd set up a new PPT date, and then they'd do it again. So then I wrote a very nice letter. Dear so-and-so, out of courtesy, I would very much appreciate moving forward if you could set these meetings when, given my availability as well. And it took about 5 times, but eventually, you know what happened? They stopped scheduling meetings without considering my availability. And that's because I changed my behavior. I very nicely let them know you have to consider my availability as well. So it's all about changing your behavior. And I can't ignore the fact that 95% of the time, it is women who advocate for their child. Gentlemen, I don't want to ignore you, but it's very important to know that statistically, the lion's share, statistically, is that the mother is the driving factor. That's not to say that fathers don't, so please don't accuse me of saying that you don't. But that's just a fact, okay? And we live in a very interesting time right now because of this women's movement, right? And don't be fooled to think that the fact that you're a woman, and when you go into the meeting, and you introduce yourself as mom, and everybody calls you mom, don't be fooled that that is not something that is designed to diminish you. And I don't think that people do it intentionally around a school table. I think it organically is what people do. But I've watched it from my perspective for 20 years. And I will never refer to a parent as mom or dad. I refer to them as the parents, and I refer to them as their name. And I encourage them to say, if somebody calls you mom or dad, say, thank you very much. Would you mind if you call me Julie? Okay? Why? Because parents are the most important members of that IEP team around the table. And while it is my most treasured job in the world to be a parent, when you're there, make no mistake about it, you are conducting business for your child. And you're not just the mother, you're not just the mom, you're not just the dad. Elevate yourself. Have everybody call you by your name. You can be very nice about it, but again, it's changing your behavior so people expect more from you. That makes sense. Okay. So, here's another little pet peeve I have. And you know what? You may not agree with me on everything, and that's okay. We can still be friends. I also don't like the idea of bringing cookies or food to the table. Because you know what? In the corporate world, this is not what people do. This is business. We're going to talk about your child's educational program, okay? And honestly, with my 20 years of watching it happen, it doesn't make a difference, and no one around that table will take anything off of that plate until everybody leaves. So, just a little tip that I have on my own. So, when you go in and you are trying to advocate for your child's rights, I need to tell you that the devil is in the details. You need to know the basics of the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is one of the reasons that Jennifer Laviato and I started a website called YourSpecialEducationRights.com. That is a free, video-based website that helps parents understand their special education rights. We've simplified it. I'm sure you're all aware of the book Wright's Law. I love Wright's Law. I have 2 unbelievably well-worn copies of Wright's Law. I couldn't live without it. But it's a little overwhelming understanding this process. So what we did is we said, we have to simplify this process for parents. We have to talk to parents like we're their girlfriends sitting across the table having coffee and saying, this is what you need to understand. So that website is designed to simplify it. And you can go on it, and there's a video series called IDEA Basics. And it will tell you the basics of the IDEA, free appropriate public education, prior written notice, and I'm going to go over some of those things. So I want to remind you that an IEPT meeting is a legal forum. It's there to protect you, it's there to protect the school district, and it's where decisions are made about your child's program. And one of the most important things that I want to share with you is this little thing called prior written notice. If you walk away with only this as your tip, I want you to really understand what prior written notice is. I hate the name of it because it's very confusing. Prior written notice, what on God's green earth does that mean? Well, what it means is that you have to be notified in writing before something happens, okay? And I'm sure you're all familiar with the IEP team pages, right? And there's a whole page just devoted to prior written notice. And it says actions proposed, actions refused. You can request an action, the school can propose an action. You both have the right to disagree with each other. But if what you've asked for, what you've requested, is not reflected on prior written notice, it never happened. So, I want you to learn the phrase when you're asking for something. I'm asking for X, Y, Z, and I'd like it recorded on prior written notice. And they have to give you an answer. And if the answer is no, they have to explain to you why. So take the time and say, okay, you've said no. Tell me what you're going to put in the box on prior written notice as to why you are refusing what I'm asking for. Because if it's not on that page and in those boxes, and if you have to go to a mediation or you have to go to a due process, which I hope people don't have to go to, that's not where we want people to go, you'll have to go all the way back to the IEP process if it's not there. So if it's not in writing, it never happened. I can't tell you how many times people call me and they say, Julie, I've been asking for this for years. Did you ask for it to be recorded on prior written notice? No. Then guess what? You haven't been asking for it for years. So if there's one thing that I want you to know is prior written notice is a very important thing when you're requesting things, okay? The other thing that I strongly recommend is audio tape your meetings. You know, that can be a little off-putting, it sort of sets a tone, but here's how I advise people to do it. Take the sting out of it. Because, you know, you don't want schools to say, I'm getting all legal on you, I'm going to audio tape my meeting. But take the sting out of it and say, you know what? This process overwhelms me. I cannot possibly remember everything that happened in this meeting. I can't write it down while everybody's talking. So I need to record it so I can go back and I can know what we've discussed. Do the school district a courtesy and let them know in writing that you're going to be audio taping it before the meeting. They have a right to audio tape as well, and it gives them a chance to also audio tape. One of the beautiful things is we now live in a world that if you have a smartphone, you have a tape recorder on your phone. And if they don't have a tape recorder, just say, you know what, I'm going to take this off. I'm heating up over here. If you have a phone, I'm happy to digitally provide it to you, the school district. If they try to tell you, well, you know, we don't have one, so you can't record, which, by the way, that's not true. Okay. So let's see, what other tips for a heavy? Oh, you know what? I also want you to know your advocacy style. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of parents over the years, and typically people don't call an advocate unless they really need the advocate, right? And there are some parents who are very weak, you know, they're just not confident at all, and then there are parents who are very, very aggressive. But you sort of have to know your advocacy style. And if that style is not working for you, adjust it accordingly, right? But the best way to present your advocacy style is by coming in with facts and being prepared. And it's okay to be emotional. It's okay. Don't lead with it. You know, I think Pete Wright's Law wrote a book called Emotions to Advocacy, right? Of course it's emotional. These are our children we're talking about. But go in with your facts. You have to know the basics of the IDEA. There's no getting around it. When they give you those procedural safeguards, as painful as they are, read them. And then go onto the internet and, you know, go onto our website and say, okay, what does that really mean? Tell me, simplify it for me. But I can't begin to emphasize how important that is. The other really important thing that I want you to know is the importance of an independent evaluation, okay? Once the school district has evaluated your child, you have the right to disagree with it and say, I would like an independent evaluation at district expense. There's a whole bunch of controversy around this in our state now. We had really good guidance. It's not such good guidance anymore. Oh, let me just stop for 1 second because I'm going to promote something else I want you to know about. I'm also the president of a new organization called SEEK of Connecticut. That stands for Special Education Equity for Kids of Connecticut. And we are a legislative group to make a difference so that we can lobby at the Capitol for the systemic issues that we see in the state. And one of them is that we're going to be focusing on is what's going on with IEEs right now, independent educational evaluations. But it's a very important group to know about because we're the voice of your children and we're the voice of parents who don't really have a voice up at the Capitol. So that's Special Education Equity for Kids of Connecticut, seekofconnecticut.org. Okay, so back to IEEs, independent educational evaluations. I'm just looking at my time here. You have up to 2 years to disagree with an evaluation, okay? Now, I'm not saying that by default you should always be disagreeing with the school district's evaluations. They could be great evaluations, so I'm not saying that. But if their evaluations aren't getting your child to the appropriate program, then you might want to consider that, okay? And it's very important to know that you have that right, okay? And they're called IEEs, Independent Educational Evaluations. Another very little known tip that I'll share with you is something called parent training. It's a related service under the IDEA with transportation, speech and language, OT, PT, parent training. It is so underutilized. And that allows you to ask the school district to say, you know what, I need to understand this, I need to understand that, can you explain it to me? Can you help me understand how I can generalize what you're doing at school? Whatever the issue is. But it's a very important, little-known, related service that I wanted to just make sure that you were aware of. I also think it's very important to know, we look at these IEPs and it's incredibly overwhelming. But here's where the devil is in the details. You need to understand what a SMART IEP goal is. And if you Google SMART IEP goals, capitalize everything, tons of stuff will come in. And sometimes there are different words for it, but basically it's specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time-bound. When you have your child's IEP, read the IEP goals, say to yourself, how are they measuring this? How am I going to know my child is going to get the skill? Okay, and just learn about SMART IEP goals. I could do a whole day on SMART IEP goals, but I'm just trying to hit upon the things that I think are very important. Also be aware of toothless IEP language. This is one of the chapters in our book. So when you're looking at the IEP goals and you say things as needed, as in Johnny will receive behavioral support as needed, this may mean he never needs it, by the way, okay? Up to, access to, upon request, with assistance, with hand-over-hand assistance. Just read those goals and really say to yourself, how am I going to know my child has this skill? Where's he starting? What's the baseline? And how do I know he's going to have this skill? Okay. Another really important tip is you can write addendums. It's another reason to take the IEP meetings. What is an addendum? Well, sometimes when you get home and you've been to the meeting, and then you read the record and you say, what I thought we talked about and what we agreed to, it's not here. Well, that's a problem. Okay, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So you can write an addendum. Dear, Director of Special Education or whomever, I've reviewed the IEP, I've noticed some discrepancies, and here is an addendum that I'd like you to attach to my child's record and make sure it's in all of his educational files. By the way, if there's anything you need to follow up on with me, or you can't write some of this stuff down quickly enough, on the way out, on the side, on the table going out, I have email forms that you can put down your email and you can follow. We'll send you, we have an email blast. You can follow us on Facebook, and I've got a whole handout on how to get in touch with me and Jen about our book. What was I just talking about? Oh, writing an addendum. So it's basically where, if you think about all the categories of the IEP, let's say discussion or PPT recommendations, and one of the recommendations isn't there. In bold letters, recommendations. We discussed XYZ. It's not here, please add it in. And I'm being overly simplified, but it's, here's what's not on the record. I want this attached as an addendum, okay? Now, let me talk about some of the things that are very specific to our kids who have autism spectrum disorders, okay? If you have a BCBA, a board certified behavior analyst on your team, and I'm not here to say you have to have ABA, but let's face it, it is very common for people to have BCBAs involved on your team. These are my little tips, okay? Well, you should also know that BCBAs now have to be licensed by the state of Connecticut, which holds them to higher standards in our school districts. Okay, I won't go into that, that's a whole other presentation. But what I like to do is to make sure that if there's a BCBA involved, that the duration and frequency of their involvement is on the IEP. So many times what I find is that the BCBA is not even on the IEP, or on the bottom of page 8, it will say consultation by the BCBA. Well, I don't know what that means. That could mean they're walking by in the hallway, and I don't mean to be flip about it, but the state demands that anybody who's working on your child's IEP team and is part of a member of that team must have the duration and frequency of their services. Is it an hour a month? Is it 2 hours a month? Demand that they write that down. Okay, that's just my opinion. You can disagree with me, but that's my experience. I think the other very important thing is to ask them to define the role of the BCBA on your team. That is going to help everyone. It's going to help you as a parent, it's going to help the school, it's going to help the BCBA. Is the BCBA there to ongoing training for the staff, data review, fidelity checks? Ask them to define their role and to make sure that that is included on the IEP. Also, so for so many of our kids with autism who may have behaviors, and if you do have a behavior intervention plan, sometimes I see a disconnect between the behavior intervention plan and with the IEP goals. So let's say there's a behavior intervention plan that addresses bolting, okay? Well, it may be on the behavior intervention plan, but for me, I'd also like that to be an IEP goal. You know, the child will reduce bolting behavior from baseline, whatever that is, by whatever percent it is. So it's not only an IEP goal, but it's also a behavior intervention plan. And you have a clear understanding of how that data is being collected and what's driving that IEP goal and for that child to make progress on that IEP goal. Another really important thing for our kids with autism spectrum disorders, if you're working with a BCBA through your home, through your insurance, that collaboration between the home team and the school team, that's really vital. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up here, but here's the other thing I want you to walk away with. It is never too early to think about your child being an adult. I am a very transition-centered person. I have been on the transition task force for the state of Connecticut for like 10 years now, okay? It is the thing that I am most passionate about. I have an adult who has autism. My son is very impacted by his autism. He's a great guy, he's got a ton of skills, and that's what it's all about. I want you to think skills, 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 and more skills, because this is all about skills. My son is a life skills kid. He didn't participate in a curriculum. He's very impacted by his autism. We've never been able to even test his IQ. He's nonverbal, he doesn't read, he doesn't write. But boy, he's a smart kid. He's incredibly intuitive, and he has a meaningful, productive adult program. And he has a great life, because you know what? He has skills. Because he had a great IEP and he had great people who made sure that the emphasis was on skills. So here's what I want you to know about transition to adulthood. It's never too early. By legally, we have to have transition in place by 16. Guess what? There's legislation pending in Connecticut that we're going to start it as early as 14. When I work with parents, I always start it early. We get pushback, but I try my gosh darn best to start that process early. And the thing that I want you to consider starting with is something called parent-centered planning. There are different names for parent-centered planning, the MAPS, the McGill Action Planning, whatever that the S stands for, system. There's different brand names of what person-centered planning is, but what is person-centered planning? That's when you come together with your team and you decide what are the goals, what are the dreams we have for our child, and of course the child is going to participate in that process if possible. With me, my child couldn't participate in that process. I had to be his voice. But when it's appropriate, the child should absolutely participate in that process. Because here's why it's so important. You can't know how to get there if you don't know where you're going. You can't know how to get there if you don't know where you're going. What are we aiming for? What are we shooting for so my child can be successful as an adult? And so that person-centered planning is a great way to start that process off and get a real anchor on where are we even going, okay? So I hope that's a tip that you can walk away with. I want to just emphasize for you, I'm gonna read to you from the IDEA what the purpose of the IDEA is. The purpose of the IDEA is to ensure that all students with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs, and here we go, and prepare them for future education, employment, and independent living. That is the whole purpose. It is in the cornerstone statement of the IDEA. Further education, employment, independent living. What is transition under the IDEA? It's a set of coordinated set of activities for a child with a disability that is designed to be within a results-oriented process that is focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, adult services, independent living, or community participation. The percentage of kids who grow up to be adults who have autism and their employment rate is deplorable. If you Google that, you'll get all sorts of numbers, but when I Googled it most recently, it's like 75 to 80% of adults with autism are unemployed. That's why it's all about skills. It's all about skills. And so what I want you to know about the transition process is there's something called post-school outcome goal statements. And there's a whole page related to transition. Read it, please. But once the child is 16, you have to have statements in there on where are you shooting for post-secondary education? Is it community college? Is it college? Is it some other type of, many kids who have autism may not go on to post-secondary education, but they may go on to culinary certificate or something like that. And then there's where are you shooting for employment? And what are you shooting for independent living? Don't fall into the trap that we usually don't put a post-school outcome goal statement for students who have autism, who have a higher intellectual quotient. We're not going to put a statement on there for independent living. Don't fall into that trap, okay? Because when you consider the skill set that you have to be a successful adult, it's overwhelming. You might want to ask for your team to do something, depending on the age of your child, called the ABLES or the AFLs. The ABLES is the assessment of basic language and learning skills. That's sort of a younger version of getting a real good sense of what their skill set is for independent living or activities of daily living. And then the AFLs, the assessment of functional living skills, is more the grown-up version. But that assessment is going to drive IEP goals, and it's a really great assessment. Write it down, look it up, because I'm running out of time. So, let's see. So, in short, to end, because I know I have to take questions, I want you to become transition-centric like I am. Do not forget about the fact that your child is going to be an adult. And for many of our kids, like my child who has an intellectual disability and very low adaptive skills, he qualifies for funding through DDS. And I do a self-directed program with him. It's the second job that I have, okay? But then there are many kids who have autism who do not have intellectual disabilities, who are not going to qualify for any funding from the state. And those, it's even more, well, I shouldn't say it's even more important, but it's oh so important for those kids who don't have intellectual disabilities that we really focus on what are the skills we need our child to have to be a successful adult. Because they're not going to be able to tap into those DDS services, which, by the way, that's a whole other story. Funding for those services, that could be a whole other day's presentation. I hope that I've been helpful. I've tried to give you, zone in on some of the most important tips that I like that guide me in my advocacy efforts. Not to be self-promoting about the book, but Helen asked me to be here to talk about it. Connecticut Feet is raffling off 10 of them. I've donated 10 of them. If you don't win one, it'll only set you back $18 on Amazon. But if you minimally go to our website, we've tried to make this website so simple for parents to understand their basic rights. So I'd love to take questions if I have time. Is there time for me to take questions?
You're still good.
Oh yes, I have time. Okay. Any questions? No questions.
All right, no, I have a couple over here.
Oh.
I'm over here. I'm over here. On your right. On your One person is asking, can you comment on supporting students transitioning between schools So for example, from elementary to middle school or middle school to high school.
What was the first part of the question?
Can you comment on supporting students' transitions between schools?
Between schools. Okay, so there's the transition between schools, and then there's the transition with capital T to adult life, right? And there's a big difference. First of all, in my experience, one of the most important things is getting to know that new team and involving the new team in the IEP process long before you get to that new school. Please understand, I'm not here to bash school districts. I just report out on sometimes just trends that I see, okay? And unfortunately, many times you get to the new school, you've got the IEP, and nobody's up to speed on like what's really going on with this child's IEP. So the best tip that I can get is to insist, and school districts do a very good job of making sure that they invite a couple of people from the new team to an IEP. But I guess my biggest tip would be, and get it in the IEP, please assure me that there is going to be a meeting with all of the people who will be on my IEP team at the new school, where they understand my child's IEP. You can ask the team, you can ask to say, I'd like to meet the people. I'd like to be at a meeting. It's very cumbersome for a school district, but hey, if you don't ask, you don't receive, and you may never, they may do it, they may not. But also to make sure that you have the numbers or the emails or however the school wants you to communicate with the members of the IEP team, that you can reach out to them. Because there's always going to be a little bit of lag and pulling up to speed.
Hello. The second part of that question was asking, you may have hit on who should be involved in that meeting or those meetings. And I don't know who asked the question, but I guess maybe specific people or specific professionals.
So in order to have a legal PPT meeting, there must be a regular education teacher and a special education teacher, in addition to other folks, but I'm just talking about teachers right now. So minimally, you're going to ask for a regular education teacher from the new school and a special education teacher. And please, Look, it's really hard running school districts, I get it, and all of the right people sometimes aren't available. But ask. I would ideally like to have the person who's going to be my child's case manager, my child's special education teacher, come to the meeting. And ideally, a regular education teacher who's also going to be involved on my son's or child's team. Minimally.
Okay, so I hope you don't mind for this next question. I'm going to summarize a little bit. This person was talking about her son having high-functioning autism and some other challenges. And the school has been cooperating, but she feels like they lack the experience to carry out the supports that he needs to make it successful. So she wants to know, how can she work with the team and encourage them to get the necessary training they need to help him and other kids on the spectrum?
Okay, great question. I go back to the IEP, and if it ain't in writing, it ain't gonna happen, okay? You need to request on prior written notice, if that's what it takes, that there will be training, whether it's of the paraprofessional or whomever, okay? That there will be training, and who will there be training by? And how often is that training going to happen? And is that person responsible for fidelity checks? Now, regarding fidelity checks or inter-observer agreements, especially when it comes to BCBAs, as parents, you don't have a right to see that data, but you do have a right to know if they're doing it, okay? Because it's all about the person who's ultimately responsible for the implementation and the fidelity of those IEP goals. And get on the IEP, who's going to do the training? How often is that training? Can I, as a parent, come to one of those trainings? Get it on the IEP so that it becomes part of that child's individualized education plan. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Gearing up for another question.
The next question is it possible to have an action written on the IEP that doesn't necessarily fall within the parameters of the school day, maybe something like after-school programming or daycare or something like that. Does that kind of summarize? Yeah, after-school programming. Because it seems like it hasn't been working. So is there something that can be written in the IEP for that?
Absolutely, and it depends, okay? If you're asking for an after-school soccer program that is not supported, is it a school-sponsored activity? What is it?
No, what we've been having trouble with is basically our child, he's been in 3 to 4 different after-school programs, and it seems the prevailing message is we don't have enough staff because he bolt or
Okay, so here's the thing that gets a little tricky about this. Many schools have after-school programs. Some of them are not sponsored by the school district, but they are on school grounds. So it's one of those little gray areas, okay? However, I think it's worth asking the team to say how can, and absolutely do it through the IEP process. They can say, well, we don't think it should be, and just say, well, I'd like to do it anyway. I'd like to have this discussion, okay? How can the school district train perhaps some of the staff in the after-school program to work best with my child? Are there protocols that we can put in place? Are there strategies? Whatever it is. Does that answer your question? Okay, this gets tricky because some of those programs are not sponsored by the school district, yet they're on the school grounds. Does that make sense? It's a tricky little area. If you want to ask me more about it privately or email me or whatever, I'm happy to give you some more specific information and strategies.
Okay, so the next one is a two-part. Is there any assessment to identify the skills or strengths in a child? And also, how can I identify those skills as a parent?
Oh, there are thousands of assessments. What particular area are you talking about?
Skills for adult life, so life skills.
Okay, so remember I talked about the AFLs, the assessment of functional living skills. There's also something called the Vineland. There's also something called the ABAS, the ABAS, the assessment of, I always forget what the heck that ABAS stands for. It'll come to me right after I walk away from here. But yes, that's it. Okay, so when you ask for the AFLs, and this is very important, or the ABLs, you want them to do the whole gosh darn thing, because there's many sections of it. Is it cumbersome? You bet it is. Is it important to drive skills for life? You bet it is. And it drives the IEP. You can't do everything all at once. You have to obviously prioritize, but it's incredibly important information to get for your baseline because it will drive the IEP, you know, for years, conceivably, depending on when you start. Okay, any other questions?
Does anybody?
I have had issues with explaining to school that I want that training, you know, under IDEA. They had said, oh, back in Virginia, for example, we had SEA, Special Education Advisory Committee, but we wouldn't get directly that training. Here in Connecticut, I'm afraid they're gonna say, oh, we have CPAC, or we have, how can I make it explain, I want that direct training to me? You know?
Okay, well, first of all, I think that if there's ever a conference that is on any kind of IDEA training, you should ask to have the IEP team support that conference under parent training as a related service. You know, they could say no, but, you know, I have parents ask that all the time, okay? The other thing that I would recommend is if you don't have a SEPTO, a special education PTO, in your district, you can start one of those, okay? If you, Audra May Talbot in the state, and oh gosh, what's his name? But if you Google how to start a septo in Connecticut, I'm sure you can find it. But a lot of that training can also happen through your septo by inviting parents, people to come and speak on those things. But one of the tricky things is those procedural safeguards that they give you, that's what you need to know more about. They already do give you that. I go back to prior written notice. If you need somebody to explain to you some of the basics of IDEA, ask on prior written notice. I need somebody to help me understand IDEA. And make it under that I'm asking under the umbrella of parent training. Okay? Any other questions? I do hope that you walk away with at least one nugget after hearing me speak. Okay, good. It was my pleasure to be here, and enjoy the rest of the day. This is a great event, and thank you so much for putting it together. Okay, Helen wanted me to remind everyone that after lunch there is a raffle. There are 20 Your Special Education Rights, What Your School District Isn't Telling You books that are going to be raffled off. And once again, if you want more information on how to follow me and Jen, on your way out, there's a table on the left that has our information and a place that you can put your email in, and we'll get you on our mailing list and all that good stuff. Thanks.
The book's available at Amazon.com too.
All right, family, we're going to take a 15-minute break, okay? Let you guys stretch your legs and maybe hit the restroom, grab a cup of coffee or so.
A 5-minute break,
She
please.
said 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Remember, in the library, there's a private area that you can speak with anyone that you may like to. You know, have your own privacy in the library behind the staircase. You can help yourself in there, have a seat, and get comfortable. And you don't want to miss who we have coming up next. It's Dr. Dave Galloway, Autism Program Director of the Institute of Professional Practice.
Thank you. You did a great job with that timer.